Good morning, good afternoon,
Good morning.
good evening. Welcome to the first episode of Adan's very own podcast, A Done Deal. Today, I have Dr. Nicholas Beecroft with me, joining us from London. And Dr. Nicholas is a renowned psychiatrist and military strategist who works with investors and founders globally on various aspects of deal making, including decision facilitation, assessment, authentic leadership, and something which is known as the devil's advocate, which is what we're going to focus on today. It's a pleasure welcoming Dr. Nicholas.
Hi, Keshav. Really nice to see you, and thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. So, Nicholas, as someone in your position who works with investors and founders on a daily basis, is there a particular episode or an incident which you'd like to share with us, something which stands out in the 30 years of experience that you've had in this space?
Wow, that's a tall order. Talk about being thrown in at the deep end. Well, let me think. Regarding devil's advocacy and decision facilitation, I had a very interesting session with the principal of a family office earlier this year, just as the coronavirus was beginning to spread out of Asia back in February, basically applied my techniques and saved him $27 million in a day. So in an afternoon, actually. So
wow.
that was a pleasure.
Wow, 27 million. That's unbelievable. That's incredible. We would love to hear a little more about how you managed to do that. And in your work, I'd just like to understand how effective is the decision making you've seen, and how do you complement that?
Yeah, I think well, obviously as a psychiatrist, I've been involved in decision making, personal and family and organizational for 25 years, and done lots of work in government and seen how governments think and how the military thinks and so on, and much work with management consultants, with chief executives, with investors and so on. So I've seen decision making in many different contexts, and so when you really see the full spectrum, there are some we're talking about investors, so obviously there are some people who automate everything and think you can boil everything down to an algorithm and a computer, and so some of them think they do well at that.
Yes.
And there are others at the other end who basically go on purely on gut feeling and intuition. And then there are probably ones in the middle who are so kind of automated, emotional, and then logical and rational. And essentially, I suppose what I've done is, put it this way: when I was at London Business School, they gave us a book which I think you with your background you might have found interesting, but with mine I found deadly boring. But it was about that thick, about business valuation, and it was basically full of various formulas and numbers and so on, which for me is like bedtime reading. But the bit that interested me was the preface, and it said, a paragraph in there said, only 50%, or this book only accounts for 50% of business valuation, and that is the rest is intangible. In other words, is it a good business idea? Can the leadership deliver? What's the company culture? Have they really worked out the dynamics of the marketplace, et cetera, et cetera? And I thought, well, okay, well, that's my area. So when I really brought myself to bear at the interface of the decision helping entrepreneurs get ready for investment, and helping investors improve the quality of their decision making and their due diligence. I really focused on how can you optimize the integration of the logical and the rational with the intuitive, with the emotional. And so basically over time, I designed a methodology where you very thoroughly take an investment decision, run it through what I call my sort of London Business School, McKinsey ultra logical process. And then frankly, the more interesting bit is, having done that, having got all the information, thoroughly cross-examined it, you then get the person or the group to speak to all their inner voices, the one that says yes, the one that says no, the fearful 7-year-old that's saying, oh my God, what happens if I get this wrong? My shareholders are going to desert me. The wise elder who sees it from a sort of a higher position, and so on. And then you literally teach people to read their heart intelligence and run the decision past that, and literally the gut intelligence. And usually that term's misused. People normally use it as like a cognitive shortcut, but literally the gut, actually the biological gut, you can learn to make a decision with that, and do the same there. And then emotions, and then muscles, and so on. And essentially from this process, usually having thoroughly and rigorously tested the decision from every angle imaginable, usually I'd say, I don't know, 80% of the time you get a very clear decision. This is what we're doing. This is how we're going to communicate it. Or where you don't, you get, I can't make the decision today, but here are the steps I need to take in order to do so.
And what sort of decision-making errors do you see consistently across the spectrum of both founders and investors?
There are many. I think, probably the most obvious one is just attention. You focus on what you focus on, you know what you know, and you don't know what you don't know, and you don't see what you're not looking at. So that's an obvious bias. But I think in organizations, one of the common things, for example, a few days ago, I was with a client from I won't say what, obviously, but a very well-known European bank who made a decision to relocate their headquarters. And that decision was made, well, internally, lots of people felt it was made unwisely, without properly thinking through all of the results. But as happens in institutions, once the bosses say this is what we're going to do, people tend not to want to speak up. They tend not to want to challenge. And also, what the boss says is right. And you see this in the military decision making, unfortunately, far too much, which is why the military actually use what's called red teaming, which is a version of devil's advocate. But anyway, once it gets going, it was a disaster, because they made really foolish decisions, burnt a load of bridges, and they really have set themselves up for massive financial losses. And if only they'd had a really good devil's advocate process or red teaming process to thoroughly challenge the logic and the rationale of the decision making at an early stage, then they could have avoided huge losses and huge unforeseen risks and so on. But once the egos get going, once the group dynamics kick in, it can be very, very difficult to change things. And they end up either making massive mistakes or wasting vast sums of money on, millions on very expensive management consultants to basically write reports to tell them what they already knew.
Well, I suppose one's judgment is distorted there because of one's ego. And I suppose it's also a good way to pass on the embarrassment to another party, right? But it takes courage and wisdom to say that I'm wrong, and invite some sort of an objective inclination to taking decisions. So, Nicholas, that was very insightful. Thank you for sharing that nugget. But how does one avoid making such poor decisions? I understand that there is a decision-making process, but I suppose that's very quantitative. What about the qualitative aspects? And could you please also enlighten us about how poor decision-making has evolved over the last few millennia?
another small
History.
question for a Sunday morning. Well, I mean, just take the term devil's advocate itself. That comes from the history of the medieval church, from the Vatican, and essentially there was a period when people get put forward or proposed as a saint, the Vatican has a process to decide, is this person a saint, or are they a fake, or how do they judge it? So they have a process, and there was a period in which the Pope noticed that there was a really lot of dodgy decisions being made, and so they thought, okay, so he appointed what they called the devil's advocate, meaning, so you've got these people who are very outwardly very sincere and offering very heartfelt propositions that this person should be a saint or whatever, but then they invited in the sort of cold, hard, logical person who's willing to say, no, I don't agree with that. Let's look at your assumptions. Let's test that. Let's look at this from multiple perspectives. Let's undermine the rationale. Let's in military terms, let's act and think like the enemy and attack this idea, in not to be destructive, but to be constructive, to really improve the quality of the decision making. And so that's where the term devil's advocate came from. And I mean, in business, obviously, this is something which, I mean, every person on earth has the capability to play devil's advocate, and it's something we all do from time to time. But really, the reason to formalize it, either in an individual who you say that's your role. Your role is to be the difficult one, to say the unpopular things. We legitimize you to do this, or or bring someone from the outside in to do that role. The reason you need to do that is because in a social system based on power and money and status, there are huge biases in the group in the group dynamics. That people want to go along with. Most people don't like to stand out. Most people don't like to criticize. Most people feel very awkward about. Obviously, you don't want to bite the hand that feeds you. You don't want to annoy your colleagues. You don't want to people to think you're annoying or cantankerous or something. And so I mean, for example, last year I was brought into a really major investment house that all of your listeners would certainly have heard from, and they had a problem in one of their investment teams, and who's considered amongst the best in the world by their results. They recognized that they had a problem, that the team, albeit really intelligent, confident, well-trained people, were very reluctant to challenge their boss, or to challenge someone else's opinion. And so they brought me in to train them how to do that, and to create the culture and the skills and the structures to make that safe to do, in order to improve their decisions. That sort of makes sense, because cynicism and failure is often frowned upon in the corporate world and also in the world of investments. But I don't recall seeing the formal role of a devil's advocate in my experience with businesses, both as a founder or as an investor. Is it becoming more common these days? Yeah, that's a good question. I think, well, I mean, if you look at, to slightly answer it from a different angle, 20 years ago, I was looking to go into the world of management consulting, and I was just having a chat with my dad, and I said, look, the thing that puts me off is that lots of them are, as far as I'm concerned, I have to try and screen my language to make it polite, but a lot of them are maybe not very authentic. Let's put it that way. And he said, well, absolutely. So you need to do it the opposite way and be super authentic. And so I actually did some research to look at the relationship between the client and the management consultant, and so interviewed a lot of chief executives and directors and owners of companies, and also the management consultants on the other side, and essentially looked at it through the lens of the medical model. So if say a patient gets a symptom, and so they have to think of, okay, that hurts, is it a problem? Do I need to do something about it? Can I solve this myself, or do I need someone else? And if I do need to consult someone, who? And basically tracked that decision-making process. And the really fascinating thing about that process was that, you might think that when a company spends a huge amount of money and time and energy on bringing in an expensive management consultant, you would think that was a highly logical, rational process, but most of it really isn't. So there's some. So this consultancy's got certain industry knowledge. They know how our competitors think, or their people are really at the cutting edge and have got lots of knowledge and sometimes it's just bums on seats. We need people to do this, so let's bring them in and so on. So there are some very rational reasons, but most of the reasons were emotional. So basically, I know what needs to happen, but I'm too afraid to say. If I say it, no one will believe me, or if I say we've got to close that division or merge or whatever, people will attack me, or if I get it wrong, I'll get the blame. And so quite often, more often than not, they're bringing in a management consultant to say what they would have said anyway, but with external credibility and also an insurance policy, and also to take the blame for uncomfortable decisions. And I could go into detail, but essentially these emotional things, these emotional and group dynamic and ego-based things block effective decision making. So so unfortunately, the truth is that most companies don't bring in devil's advocate, either externally or internally, and that's why they keep making such big mistakes. And it's not just companies. Would we have invaded Iraq if there had been proper, disciplined red teaming and devil's advocacy? Of course not. And there are loads of business decisions like that all the time. So some do, but most don't. And pay the price.
I mean, all very valid points. Could you please give us an example of how one would use a devil's advocate in a business context?
Well, the best thing is to take a very successful example. There's a chap I'm sure you'd have heard called Ray Dalio, who's the founder of Bridgewater, one of the world's most successful hedge funds. And basically, and he's written this story in his book Principles, which you can read. Essentially, in the 80s and 90s, he was extremely successful, and the success went to his head, and he became quite arrogant, and also others began to worship him, and success bias. They began to think everything he does is right. Everything, let's look how he walks, how he thinks, what clothes he wears, and copy it. And they some people began to treat him like Jesus walking on water. And then conditions changed, the economy turned down, the assumptions on which his decisions changed, and basically it collapsed, and he lost absolutely everything, right down to having to sack every single member of his staff. And you can't get more of a crash than that. And however, he dealt with that in a really mature way, a really wise and mature way. And he said, okay, right, so clearly I was doing some things right for most of the time, but then I got it spectacularly wrong. and he went basically down to philosophy. How do I know I'm right when I make an assertion, or I say this is a good company, that's a good investment, this is a significant geopolitical risk, or whatever it is. How do I know that's true? Basic philosophy. And when he went into it, he realized that even the most intelligent people, really well trained, very experienced, very knowledgeable, with all the best intentions, make mistakes, because we can't possibly know everything. We can't have all knowledge, and we can't look at things from all perspectives. And so what he did was to design a system in which devil's advocacy, red teaming, contrarian thinking is absolutely embedded in the decision-making process. And so his book shows how he does that. So essentially, he has a whole the culture of his organization is that when anyone, including him, it's essential that people challenge people. In many organizations, if someone challenges the boss, they get sacked or they get sidelined. In his company, it's the other way around. If you don't challenge the boss, you're sacked. If you don't, so they have teams that, in a very structured, organized, and disciplined way. So someone comes along with saying we should make this acquisition or something. They make their proposal, and then a diverse team, not a genuinely diverse team, not the sort of PC fake diversity, but lots of people from genuinely different backgrounds, genuinely different training, different ways of thinking, different personalities, rigorously and ruthlessly test the assumptions and the logic. And basically, over time, he evolved this process to grow to, I think, to be not only the most successful, but I think more than twice as big as the next hedge fund. So that's probably the best success story I know.
Wow, the proof's in the pudding. Clearly, that's worked really well, and I suppose has paved the path for this refreshing style of thinking. On that note, Nicholas, you and I have, excuse me, seen this happen with businesses in general, that most business decisions are taken by teams. However, when it comes to such different styles of thinking, how does one use contrarian thinking styles whilst still remaining effective in not just the team environment, but also in the context of the business as a whole?
That's a really great question, Keshav, because one of the reasons that, to go back to your earlier question, why don't people use the devil's advocate? There are many ego reasons and group dynamic reasons, but another reason is, look, I know what we need to do. Let's just get on. All this talking, all this analysis is wasting time. Let's just, you're just blocking us now. Let's just get into action. And action is necessary, but what you don't want is analysis paralysis. You don't want a load of people sitting in circle, holding hands, sharing feelings endlessly in a postmodern directionless blancmange that goes nowhere. Absolutely not. That's the kiss of death. Well, not always. Sometimes it's useful for creativity or for problem solving and so on. But in terms of an executive. Executive decision making, you wouldn't want to do that. So the people who do this the best are the military. The military basically have, obviously they have to do really big stuff, major things, life and death, huge complex interventions, often at incredibly short notice, often put in a position which they didn't want to be in by the politicians or leaders. And so basically they've evolved a way to do it. And, so for example, if you read Sun Tzu, The Art of War, which is almost the cliche business strategy, you have to mention that, but read his stuff. Know your enemy. The people that and business, well, they didn't say businesses,
Yes.
militaries that succeed are those that not only know their enemy but also know themselves,
Yes.
and rigorously so. And
Self-awareness. Mm.
exactly. And much further forward, in the term red team that I use comes
Yes.
from the Prussian army, where
Okay.
in the era when Napoleon was from France was basically running all over Europe, all over the world, making amazing, incredible military gains, and the other countries were just desperately trying to catch up. They were really
Yes.
backward. The
Mm-hmm.
Prussian high command realized that on a one-to-one battle,
Mm-hmm.
commander to commander battle,
Mm-hmm.
they couldn't possibly beat Napoleon because he was so capable. But they thought,
Yes.
well, maybe as a team, if we put together our team knowledge, our team expertise, maybe we'll beat him. And so
Mm.
they basically developed their strategy, and they were doing lots and lots of wargaming. So and
Okay.
their uniforms were blue, and
Okay.
so they created two teams, the blue team and the red team. And
Mm-hmm.
so the blue team were the Prussians, who had their strategy or their tactics for a particular
Yes.
battle or a particular course of
Mm-hmm.
action.
Mm-hmm.
And the group that played the red team, their job would be to basically act and think like the enemy, and
Okay.
to beat them, and
Yes.
in doing so, get into the enemy mindset, get into a really
Mm-hmm.
creative mindset,
Mm-hmm.
break the assumptions, step outside the
Mm-hmm.
paradigm, um, think creatively about all the different ways you can undermine the strategy. And
Yes.
again, this is not a destructive process. People could do this in a kind of a moronic way just to be difficult, or just
Yes.
to undermine, just kind of an ego game. But done
Oh.
right, this is a
Mm.
highly constructive process in which you're
Yes.
taking a strategy or a business proposition or a
Yes.
an acquisition decision, and you're thoroughly testing it before launch, making
Yes.
sure from every angle that you've got it right. And where you find faults or where you find unforeseen risks or
Right.
opportunities, you then
Right.
adapt and continuously improve. And basically, the military when the military is successful, they do this. And so, I
Yes.
mean, for example, the Germans, the Blitzkrieg, which
Mm-hmm.
was super successful, where Germans swept across Europe,
Yes.
that came out of this kind of process.
Oh, is it?
Um,
Okay.
but much to their own detriment, they didn't do it for Operation Barbarossa invading Russia. And had they had a devil's advocate or a red team, they certainly
Yes.
wouldn't have done it that way.
Yes.
And likewise, in modern times, as I said, Iraq, we definitely wouldn't. I mean, for example, after 9/11,
Yes.
our people and the Americans, realized, my God, we really need to shake ourselves up and think differently. And so they
Mm-hmm.
really stepped up and did a lot more red teaming.
I
Um,
see.
but since they do less and less and less, and the egos and the control freaks take over again until they make their next big mistake.
Well, yes, that always happens, and history repeats for a reason, I suppose.
Mm.
Um, but in the game we are in, we tend to test and optimize decisions almost on a daily basis, be it a decision about an acquisition or an investment, or a pitch, or a growth or an acquisition strategy. Or for that matter, something as trivial as a launch. How do you go about understanding what the parameters are and how can it go wrong?
Absolutely, yeah.
Nicholas, while you have obviously worked with the military and the government and various other similar institutions in the past, how do you cross apply some of that thinking and the lessons that you have learned working alongside this distinguished cohort, and how do you apply that to businesses, especially working with fund managers? Could you please give us an example of working with hedge fund managers or private equity fund managers?
Well, actually, I'll give you an example from a family office that I mentioned earlier.
Or family office?
I back in February,
Hmm.
I was with one of my clients who's a principal of a very successful family office, and
Okay.
basically he was making a decision, an
Okay.
$80 million decision as to whether or not to invest in a particular houseware company, sort of kitchenware type company. And from his point of view, as he was going into it, he's very relaxed about this. It was no big deal. It wasn't, in his mind, it was just routine business. But he kind of wanted to test drive my process, the decision facilitation and the devil's advocate process, to see if it was any good. And so going into this decision, he was very confident that he was going to invest in this company. It was a good company. He knew it well. He knew the market. He was very familiar with the dynamics of it. And he'd crunched all the numbers, and it was clear that it was significantly undervalued. And he could see good long-term, he was looking to invest for the long term. It wasn't like day trading. We were talking like 5-10 years. And it looked good, basically. And really, for him, this was just like a tick box exercise to put me to the test. And so basically, took him through that process. And the initial part, as I said, the process basically, the initial bit of the process, I call it my logical, rational London Business School McKinsey approach, in which, which I think most of your listeners would be very familiar with, essentially extremely rigorously going through the logic of the decision. Why is this a good decision? What makes you think that? Testing the logic, testing the assumptions, testing the information. Also looking at the values and the principles and the priorities of the decision maker, because those affect it. Looking at any potential biases that might be influencing their decision making. But standard pros and cons, risks and benefits, ideal future outcomes, worst case disasters, and so on. And essentially very, very rigorously doing that. And I find that normally for someone like him, who is absolutely top class, usually that doesn't show up too much. I mean, when you do it with someone who's inexperienced or maybe making a decision in a hurry, that process brings things up. But for someone really top class, that usually you might tweak one or two things. But the interesting thing comes in the second bit, where you then, as I described it earlier, you go into the inner dialogue. Also, and in that you bring in his case, I often bring in, get people to think like their ideal investor would think. So in his case, Warren Buffett or Charlie Munger. Also, mentors and so on, and also you can check with your stakeholders and your shareholders and your own inner devil's advocate and so on. And basically that inner dialogue, then the heart and so on. And basically in running into that process, it was very interesting, because something I find with really top class people, I mean, I'm talking like the super successful, the really top level people, that when I do that with them, I'm often quite surprised that when I say, right, let's go into your inner fearful one, like for a different person, different investor, is it inner fearful 7-year-old saying, oh my God, if I get this wrong, all my shareholders are going to withdraw their money, my reputation will be in tatters, I won't be able to afford the school fees, oh my God, what do I do? And anyway, with this chap, it was what you talk. He said to me, Nicholas, I haven't had fear since I was age 6, and that's not kind of boasting. I could tell that was true. And you often get that with really successful people, which is one reason they're able to be super courageous, take amazing risks and so on. But there's a big but, and the but is that their amazing strength is also their weakness. And that means that because fear has obviously a survival benefit, not if you're plagued with fear, you can't do anything. You're
Yes.
incapable. You're useless and incapable and
Yes.
vulnerable. But a degree of fear is, or awareness of threats is absolutely essential.
Yes.
And sometimes these super successful people miss that, and sometimes they miss that. And in this case, because he'd been a bit lacking in fear, he hadn't picked up some really clear risks. So in this case, one of them was marketing. In fact, this came, to be honest, this particular marketing thing came up in the logical bit. So when we looked at the information and the logic on which his decision was based, it basically showed up that the models were based on outdated marketing data, and there'd been some new marketing data which was due in 6 months to 4 to 6 weeks, and the outcome of that was unknown, and there was no intelligence on it, and that could significantly sway the stock price. So that was one thing, and obviously that began to sow a seed of doubt. Maybe we should wait for that. But of course, that cuts both ways. You could lose out as a result. But the massive, great big hole that he'd missed was, and I think like a lot of people, at the beginning of the coronavirus thing, he really hadn't thought through the supply chain issue. That suddenly realized that, the manufacturing supply chain of this company was basically sitting on ships across the world coming from China. And yes, for the next couple of months, they would be arriving. But after that, then what? They'd probably be blocked, or the factories would be shut, or, it was a massive, massive unforeseen risk. And then obviously secondary to that, when you think that through, then you realize, oh my God, there's going to be major economic and geopolitical consequences coming from this in terms of, the hotting up of the trade war and this kind of correction that Donald Trump is trying to achieve with the Chinese, etc. And anyway, basically, it made it clear that actually this was quite a risky decision that he hadn't foreseen. His fear hadn't triggered that. I then took him to his inner critic, and he didn't have an inner critic. He said, what do you mean? And I said, well, the inner voice that says, you're an idiot, this is a mistake, you don't know what you're doing. He said, well, I've never had that. I simply don't get that. I wish I could have that. But anyway, punchline is, we ran through this process. We'd identified the unforeseen marketing risk, the geopolitical risk, the economic risk, the supply chain risk, and these were huge. And he simply hadn't seen these. And this is a super experienced person. And so the decision was now looking like, okay, we're going to, maybe it makes sense to delay the decision, put this off for 6 weeks until the marketing data, until we see how this is playing out, and then and decide there. And basically it was hedging that way. And then I ran him through his heart intelligence. So I won't get into detail because we don't have time, but basically trained him to read his heart intelligence, his gut intelligence, his emotional intelligence, his muscle and body intelligence, energetic consciousness intelligence. And in this case, it was an individual making a decision, but in a group, you would do the group dynamic intelligence as well, which obviously takes a bit longer. And essentially at the end of that process, it was really clear that the decision was to delay. Actually, there's big risk here. Let's delay. Let's not make a decision. Let's not invest today. That's a decision. And let's decide to review this in 6 weeks' time.
Okay, so I mean that was one hell of a journey, I must say, for both the owner as well as for yourself, Nicholas. So just to understand this correctly, initially he was very confident that he would invest in the company, but then after running through your model and through your process, he changed his mind. There are a couple of ways of looking at this, and one of them could be that this constitutes investment advice. Is that investment advice, or is there something more to it?
Absolutely, categorically, no.
Okay.
No, that's in my contract, to make that really clear. No,
Okay.
I'm a medical doctor, a psychiatrist,
Okay.
military
Okay.
psychiatrist.
Okay.
And so no, I'm absolutely. I mean, obviously, I've got lots of knowledge and experience, but absolutely not. No, I'm not in a position to give business advice, or certainly not investment advice. But basically, I run the process that gets the person to using their knowledge and their skills, but gets them to step up to Olympic standard to make the very best decision that they can, and to thoroughly test it, to get them. It's coaching, basically, to get them to make the best decision.
Okay, so it's essentially the other party's decision, not really influenced by anything that you've sort of used in the process, right? Just to clarify. And in hindsight, Nicholas, was that the right decision for him?
Well, we checked it, we tracked it, and yes, over that 6-week period, if he had invested, he would have lost $27 million.
27 million. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I could buy a nice little 110-foot yacht with that kind of money.
That's right.
Were you invited on that yacht, Nicholas?
No, the invitation's still in the post. I think.
Okay.
Been delayed by the coronavirus.
It's been delayed by 6 weeks. Can he now make better decisions on his own following your process?
I wouldn't like to put it that way, because in this case it would sound incredibly patronizing, because we're dealing with someone who is a top class master investor. But I think the way that he saw it, the reason that he brings me in, is because he sees himself as like an Olympic athlete who wants to go from absolutely top to even better. So it's more like that. So I mean, I'd say, like most, as I said at the beginning, really, most experienced investors are very, very good at the intellectual, logical, rational, numerical side of things. It doesn't mean they're perfect. And as you know, with models, it's usually the assumptions and the paradigm that's the problem.
Yes.
And it works for a while, and then it's wrong when conditions change. But nevertheless, they generally are pretty good at that end of it. But where there's massive room for improvement, where it's really variable, where there's real idiosyncrasy, is in the qualitative side. For example, for an investor, does this leadership team have what it takes to succeed? Does the chief executive think and act like a shareholder? And those qualitative decisions are much harder. And also the actual decision-making process with the group dynamics, the heart, the gut. We aren't. I mean, the really interesting thing about humans is that although we're not, we're living in a world which is extremely unnatural. It's not. This is not the world that, however long you say, 100,000 or 1 million years of evolution, we've not been living in these conditions, making these type of decisions. But nevertheless, we are perfectly evolved to do so, because we've got our logical mind, our rational mind, all of our many levels of cognitive processing. We've got our threat system, our emotional system. We've got our heart intelligence, our gut intelligence, our energetics, our body intelligence, and crucially, our group dynamic knowledge and intelligence. And when you really harness all of these, that's where the room for improvement is in individuals and in groups.
Okay, well, that's a phenomenal perspective towards looking at decisions, Nicholas. But for some of us who are, I suppose, unaware of all these parameters, do you think we could benefit? Is it necessary to get in a devil's advocate for every decision that we take in our day-to-day business lives?
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously not. And the main reason would be cost and time.
Right.
But the vast majority of decisions are not that important, not that
Uh-huh.
valuable, and the risks are not that significant. So,
Mm.
but where it is the thing to do is high risk, high value, high
Mm.
profile, high
Mm.
reputational. So really, there's two reasons to do it. The top reason is
Yes.
if you really want to make a good decision and thoroughly, rigorously test it.
Right.
And so it's got to be worth doing in terms of time and money. But
Right.
secondly,
Mm.
especially in institutional decision making, whether that
Right.
be in big banks,
Right.
big investment houses, or government.
Oh,
But
like Ray Dalio at Bridgewater.
yes, but the really big reason to do it is to
Yes.
protect your own ego and not look like an
Mm.
idiot when you make a mistake, because
Okay.
so that you can really demonstrate within the organization that you've thoroughly tested your decision making. And even if you
Right.
make a mistake, you can say, look, I've run through this due diligence process, we did our best, and okay, if it didn't turn out right, at least we didn't do this on the back of a cigarette packet. This was a thoroughly tested, rigorously
Yes.
tested. So there's also the insurance policy side of it. But I think,
Yes.
in reality, I've evolved this model from psychiatry, from human decisions. I've evolved it through medicine, through the military, through government, and
Right.
brought it into the world of investors. But
Okay.
nevertheless, as soon as I run a workshop or run a process, invariably people want to do it for their really important decisions, which has got nothing to do with investing in companies. It's
Right.
shall I get married? Shall I get divorced?
Ah. Okay.
Shall I have a baby?
Okay.
Or even
Okay.
last year I did it with a government. Shall we invade country X? And
Oh. Ooh.
I red
Okay.
teamed their invasion plan. So
Okay.
there are lots of basically high value, high risk decisions.
Okay. Phenomenal. Phenomenal. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Dr. Nicholas Beecroft. The Devil's Advocate Red Teaming and Decision Facilitation services are now available via Adan Corporate's suite of corporate advisory services. And if you'd like to get in touch with Dr. Nicholas or with myself, please drop us a line. The contact details can be found right down below on this website. And we look forward to hearing your thoughts and speaking to you about your business and how red teaming can assist these businesses. Okay, on that note, take your leave then. Have a good day, have a good evening, and see you on the next podcast.